Logic is only as good as what you feed it. Hashtag philosophy, logic, misinformation. The myth of pure reason. There is a widespread assumption, especially among people who consider themselves rational, that logic is a self-correcting mechanism. That if you reason carefully enough, you will arrive at the truth. That the act of thinking well is by itself sufficient protection against being wrong. This is false, and not in a small way. It is false in a way that has driven civilizations into ruin, justified atrocities with pristine syllogisms, and turned otherwise intelligent people into confident vehicles of harm. Logic is a machine. It is an extraordinarily powerful machine, perhaps the most powerful tool humanity has ever developed. But like every machine, it has a dependency that precedes its operation: input. A combustion engine does not care whether you feed it gasoline or sugar water. It will attempt to run either way. Logic is the same. Feed it truth, and it will produce truth. Feed it garbage, and it will produce elegant, structurally sound, internally consistent garbage. The formal term for this is garbage in, garbage out. But that phrase has become so familiar that it has lost its teeth. So let me restate it with the weight it deserves. A logically valid argument built on false premises is not merely wrong. It is dangerously wrong because it looks right. Validity is not truth. This is the distinction that most people never learn and that most public discourse ignores entirely. In formal logic, an argument is valid if the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. An argument is sound if it is valid, and all its premises are true. These are not the same thing. Consider, all birds can fly. A penguin is a bird, therefore a penguin can fly. This argument is valid. The structure is flawless. The conclusion follows inevitably from the premises. And it is completely, demonstrably wrong, because premise one is false. Not all birds can fly. The logic did its job perfectly. The logic was never the problem. The information was the problem. Now consider more dangerous versions, and notice that no political tribe is immune. All people who increase crime rates should be deported. Immigrants increase crime rates, therefore immigrants should be deported. The structure is valid. It is a textbook categorical syllogism. If both premises were true, the conclusion would follow necessarily. But premise 2 is not true, not as a general claim supported by evidence. In the United States, decades of research consistently show that immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens. The premise is not a fact. It is a narrative. But once accepted as fact, the logic that follows from it is airtight, and that is precisely what makes it so destructive. Now consider one from the other direction. If all outcome disparities between groups are caused by discrimination, then eliminating discrimination will eliminate all disparities. All outcome disparities between groups are caused by discrimination. Therefore, eliminating discrimination will eliminate all disparities. This, too, is structurally valid, a straightforward modus ponens. And premise 2 is a narrative, rather than a universal fact. Outcome disparities are real, and discrimination is a real and documented cause of many of them. But they also arise from differences in geography, historical access to capital, cultural emphasis, immigration recency, and dozens of other factors that have nothing to do with active discrimination. Treating a complex, multi-causal phenomenon as though it has a single cause produces expectations and policies that may be ineffective, misdirected, or harmful to the very people they intend to help. The logic is clean. The premise is incomplete, and the confidence is unearned. The point is not to equate these examples or to suggest that both sides are equally wrong. They are wrong in different ways, about different things, with different consequences. The point is that false premises do not belong to any ideology. Every tribe has its sacred narratives that function as unexamined premises. And every tribe's reasoning machinery will dutifully process those narratives into conclusions that feel inevitable. A false premise does not produce a weak argument. It produces a compelling argument that happens to be wrong. This is worse than no argument at all, because it recruits the machinery of reason into the service of falsehood. The fallacy trap, while logically invalid, doesn't mean entirely wrong. Here is where it gets uncomfortable, and where most people's thinking stops short. When someone constructs an argument that contains a logical fallacy, the reflexive response among the logically literate is to dismiss the entire argument. That's an ad hominem. That's a false cause. That's a straw man. And then the conversation ends. The person who made it is coded as irrational, and the person who identified the fallacy walks away feeling intellectually superior. But this is itself a mistake, a subtle and important one. A logical fallacy means the reasoning structure is broken. It does not mean the conclusion is false. A conclusion reached through fallacious reasoning might still be true. It just hasn't been demonstrated to be true by that particular argument. The conclusion is unsupported, not refuted. If someone says my grandfather smoked his whole life and lived to 95, therefore smoking isn't dangerous, that is a textbook anecdotal fallacy. The reasoning is invalid, but the invalidity of the reasoning does not make the conclusion about smoking automatically true or false. The conclusion happens to be false, but we know that from epidemiological evidence, not from identifying the fallacy. This matters because in practice people often arrive at correct conclusions through flawed reasoning and incorrect conclusions through impeccable reasoning. The quality of the reasoning and the truth of the conclusion are independent variables. Confusing them is itself a logical error, the fallacy, the assumption that because an argument is fallacious, its conclusion must be false. The lesson is not that fallacies don't matter, they do. The lesson is that identifying a fallacy is the beginning of the analysis, not the end of it. The question after identifying a fallacy is not, can I dismiss this? But what would it take to make this argument actually work? And this connects directly to the information supply chain problem. When people use fallacy spotting as a reason to stop investigating, they stop looking at the underlying claims that may be true, false, or partially true in ways that matter. The habit of dismissing arguments at the first structural flaw is itself a way of filtering out information before it gets properly examined. It is, in its own way, another failure of input. Not because the information was never available, but because the reasoner decided they didn't need it. The real problem, the information supply chain. So if logic is a machine, and its output depends entirely on its input, then the most important question in any society is not are people reasoning well, but what information are people reasoning from? This is where the crisis lives. Not in logic, not in human stupidity. In the information supply chain, the entire ecosystem of sources, incentives, platforms, and gatekeepers that determine what people believe to be true before they even begin to reason. Consider what has happened to that supply chain in the last 2 decades. Local journalism collapsed. Between 2005 and 2024, the United States lost more than 2,900 newspapers. The communities left behind, news deserts, did not stop consuming information. They started consuming whatever filled the vacuum: partisan media, social media, and algorithmically curated content, optimized not for accuracy, but for engagement. Algorithms optimized for engagement, not truth. Social media platforms discovered that outrage, fear, and tribal identity drive more engagement than nuance, context, or accuracy. The information environment was not designed to inform. It was designed to capture attention. The result is an information ecosystem where the most viral content is systematically the least reliable. Institutional trust eroded, often for legitimate reasons. As I've written before, people who say the system is rigged are not hallucinating. They are pattern matching on evidence. But when institutional trust collapses, it does not get replaced by careful individual epistemology. It gets replaced by alternative authorities, influencers, ideologues, conspiracy networks that offer certainty in place of the ambiguity that honest institutions cannot avoid. Deliberate disinformation became industrialized. State actors, political operatives, and commercial interests discovered that manufacturing false premises at scale is cheaper and more effective than winning arguments on the merits. If you can control what people believe to be true, you do not need to out-argue them. Their own reasoning will do your work for you. This is the architecture of the problem. The logic works. The people are not stupid. The inputs are poisoned. The compounding effect. How bad information scales. Bad information does not stay contained. It compounds. A single false premise. Vaccines cause autism, for instance, does not produce a single bad conclusion. It cascades. Consider this argument. If vaccines cause autism, then health agencies that approve vaccines are knowingly endangering children. Vaccines cause autism. Therefore, health agencies that approve vaccines are knowingly endangering children. This is valid, a clean modus ponens, and from that conclusion the cascade continues. If health agencies are endangering children, they cannot be trusted. If they cannot be trusted, then their guidance on all health matters is suspect. If official guidance is suspect, then alternative sources, no matter how unqualified, start to look like the only honest authorities. Each step, taken as a conditional, is logically valid. The structure is internally coherent. The cascade is self-reinforcing. And it all began with a single false premise, one that was, in fact, based on a fraudulent study that has been retracted, its author stripped of his medical license. This is not a failure of logic. This is logic doing exactly what it is designed to do, drawing conclusions from premises. The catastrophe is not that the machine broke. The catastrophe is that the machine was fed poison and performed flawlessly. What does this mean for you? If you followed the argument this far, the implication is uncomfortable. Being logical is not enough. You can be rigorous, disciplined, and consistent in your reasoning and still be catastrophically wrong. Not because your thinking is flawed, but because the information you're thinking with is flawed. Reason without epistemology, without a serious, ongoing, effortful practice of verifying what you believe to be true, is not rationality. It is sophisticated gullibility. This means the hard work is not the reasoning. The hard work is upstream of the reasoning. Where did this claim come from? Not who shared it, who originated it, what was their methodology, what are their incentives, what would change my mind? If you cannot answer this question about your own belief, you do not hold a reasoned position. You hold a conviction. Those are different things. Am I verifying or am I confirming? There is a difference between seeking evidence and seeking validation. The first is epistemology. The second is shopping. Do I understand the difference between this argument is valid and this argument is true? Because if you don't, you will be persuaded by every well-constructed argument you encounter, regardless of whether its premises are real. The responsibility of the reasoner. Logic is innocent. It does what it does. It is a tool, and like all tools, it carries no moral weight of its own. The moral weight falls entirely on the person wielding it, and specifically on what they choose to feed it. A society that teaches logic without teaching epistemology produces a population that is more dangerous than one that reasons poorly, because it produces people who are confidently, articulately, and persuasively wrong. People who can construct arguments that pass every test of validity while failing every test of truth. People whose certainty is mathematically derived from premises they never bothered to verify. The antidote is not less logic. It is more humility about what we claim to know, more rigor about where our information comes from, and more willingness to hold our own premises to the same standard we apply to everyone else's. I say this not from a position of immunity. I've built arguments I was proud of, logically airtight, rhetorically sharp, only to discover later that the premise I started from was something I'd absorbed uncritically, because it confirmed what I already believed. The experience of realizing your own reasoning has been working against you while feeling like it was working perfectly. That is a specific kind of humility you do not forget. It is also the reason I'm writing this. Reason is humanity's greatest inheritance. But it is an inheritance that comes with a condition. You must earn the right to use it by doing the hard, unglamorous, often uncomfortable work of making sure you are reasoning from reality, not from what you wish reality were. Logic is a weapon. The question is not whether you know how to use it. The question is whether you've checked what's loaded in it. Next, the filter you don't see, on cognitive bias, and how your own mind distorts the information before logic even begins.